Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to welcome you to the Center for the Pacific Rim here at the University of San Francisco. We are delighted this evening to be able to contribute something to this fabulous production of Richard Wagner's Ring. I hope some of you have seen all or parts of it. And we have with us tonight a very wonderful person who ties us into the opera, us being the University of San Francisco, and the opera being the San Francisco Opera. And she's standing over there glaring at me now. Her name is Dolores DeStefano, and she just wants to welcome you on the part of the San Francisco Opera and also to introduce our two speakers.
Thank you very much, Patrick. So I would like to welcome you all. Again, my name is Dolores DeStefano, and I work in the education department at San Francisco Opera. And like Patrick said, I hope some of you have been able to see our Ring productions or will soon be seeing them. I hope also that you were able to attend the first part of this panel discussion this past Thursday at the Asian Art Museum. We're very grateful to them for hosting that as well. And I would very much like to thank Patrick and everyone here at the Center for the Pacific Rim for organizing this event this evening. I'd like to introduce our panelists. First, Peter Bassett, who is a writer and lecturer on opera and also a broadcaster, I should say, and particularly the works of Richard Wagner. He's been closely involved with many productions of Wagner's works in Australia, and he contributes to program books and publications of opera companies and symphony orchestras throughout Australia and New Zealand. He's also led opera tours for the patrons of Opera Australia, which must be really fun. I wish we could all go. He's also a former Australian diplomat. So thank you very much, Peter, for being here this evening. I'd also like to introduce our second panelist, Paul Schofield, who did speak at the Asian Art Museum on Thursday, so some of you may already be familiar with him, but just to recap, he entered the Zen Buddhist monastery of Shasta Abbey in California in 1991, and he was ordained as a Zen Buddhist monk in 1992. In 2001, he was given permission to return to lay life. He's currently a lay member of the order in order to write and speak about Wagner and Buddhism. And he has been a board member and editor of the Wagner Society of Northern California. And he is the author of The Redeemer Reborn, Parsifal as the fifth opera of Wagner's Ring. So I'm going to turn it over to Patrick now, and I hope you all enjoy the panel. Thanks very much for coming.
Okay, we'll start right in with a few comments that I'll make, and then I'll turn it over to our two experts. I'm a historian. I was hired here as the Kiriyama Fellow in the Center of the Pacific Rim, and I'd like to put this evening in a historic mode. Richard Wagner was born in Leipzig in 1813. He died in Venice in 1883. He was one of 9 children, the youngest. His father died 6 months after he was born. His mother fell in love with an actor, who then married her and took the whole gaggle to Dresden. It's very important for people to understand that Wagner's formative years were in Saxony, the capital of which is Dresden. It's important to understand that Dresden was the Florence of the North. It was a huge intellectual, academic, artistic community. It was made so in the 18th century by a famous head of state, Augustus the Strong. And Augustus, as early as the 18th century, fell in love with everything that was coming from the east. He created north of his great capital city a small little village to make nothing but porcelain. Meissen porcelain, and there on the Meissen you saw the new flowers, the camellia, the peony, and also the Eastern version of dragons running around plates and cups. It was also his desire to recreate in his capital a vision of the East. If you are lucky enough and ever go to Dresden, you take the ship up the Elbe into the Saxon Alps. The Saxon Alps are about as high as the foothills here in the Sierras. But in that area, he built many pavilions that he thought represented what he was seeing come from the East. So there are Japanese pavilions, Chinese pavilions, full of the artwork that he was able to collect that was brought back by European explorers. So way before Wagner arrives in Dresden, Dresden is already a capital very enthusiastic about all things Eastern, but not in the way, and I mean this in no demeaning way, that Paris was. Paris was interested in it as Orientalism. It was something that meant the other, the outsider, and the different. In the German case, particularly by the 19th century, they were interested in it in a philosophical sense. And the great connecting link from German philosophy to Wagner is the name Shopenhauer. And it was Schopenhauer's way of looking, as flawed as it was. I don't know, some of you are experts on this perchance, but the Buddhist texts that were coming into Europe came mainly from India through Ceylon. In many cases, they came in Sanskrit, so they were translated into French. And then it had to be translated again into German. And if you've ever done any scholarly work, you know that each translation loses something in the process. Nevertheless, the German philosophers were enthusiastic about this phenomena in their intellectual life, in their universities, in their academies, and they had one great philosopher in the form of Schopenhauer to bring it really to their attention. And Wagner himself, who had gone through the academies, who had risen rather rapidly, who was then in Dresden, in and out, because he went back to Leipzig also, took and drank from these waters. So it depends on what you believe as to how much your environment influences you. But he stayed in Dresden for a very long time. He then, like many people who get involved in the arts, had problems with money and women. He also lived in Riga. He also lived in London. And his biggest ambition was to have an opera succeed in Paris. But unfortunately, he couldn't write ballet music, so he did not have a success in Paris. Nor did Giuseppe Verdi, the two giants of the 19th century. It was because in Paris at the time they were in love with Orientalism, so instead you went to hear Meyerbeer's Afrikaan, or you went to hear something by Bizet called The Pearl Fishers, or you even went to India itself and listened to Massenet's The King of Lahore. So it was up later to the Germans to incorporate the philosophical side, that is, those important ideas about how persons lead out their lives, what life itself means, and our two guests will start and give you that in depth. So I now turn over the panel first to Peter.
Thank you, Patrick. Ladies and gentlemen, can I say, first of all, what a great pleasure it is to be back in San Francisco, particularly for something as magnificent as the Ring. When I was here last year for Die Walküre, I was hugely impressed and decided that I had to come back and see the complete cycle this year. I'd like to begin with a little quotation, if I may. The Buddha's teaching is such a grand view of life that every other one must seem rather small when compared to it. The philosopher with his deepest thoughts, the scientist with his largest results, the artist with his most extravagant imagination, the man with the most open heart for everything that breathes and suffers, they all find their unlimited abode in this wonderful and incomparable conception of the world. Those are the words of Richard Wagner. How did he come to this conclusion? On the screen is a timeline from his birth in 1813 to his death in 1883, showing how the major works of his maturity relate to those of what we might call his middle period. And it's interesting to see how the great works, Tristan, Meistersinger, The Ring, Parsifal, overlap to a considerable degree. Extraordinary, I think, when you think how each one has a very different musical ambience. The light colours are the periods in which he was thinking about them, working on them, preparing them, and the dark colours, those years in which he was actively engaged on those particular operas. If we go to the second image, we can see that he was in fact thinking about many other things other than these great works. There were in fact a great many unfinished works that he began, sketched, sometimes even got as far as writing librettos for, and then didn't pursue. The early ones are very much feeling his way, trying to find his own style. But by the time we get to the 1840s, we have the arrival of a lot of important ideas that will eventually find their way into works such as The Ring, Tristan and Parsifal. Wagner was very much a man of ideas, and his works reflect those. But the great turning point as far as his interest in philosophical matters, and particularly Buddhism, was concerned, was his reading of Schopenhauer's magnum opus, The World as Will and Representation, in 1854. This was a major event in his artistic and intellectual development, and one that remained with him to the end of his life. Even in 1870, his wife Cosima records in her diary that he was composing Götterdämmerung in the morning and reading Schopenhauer in the evening. So it was a source of renewal, a source of inspiration into which he dipped constantly throughout his creative life. A year or two after reading The World as a Will and Representation, he started to read Buddhist works, and particularly Bernhoft's Introduction to the History of Indian Buddhism, on which he was to base a draft for an opera, which was never completed, called Die Sieger, the Victors. And Paul's going to talk about this in some detail a little later on. It was an opera, to be an opera about the Buddha. He elaborated a prose sketch in 1856, and he continued to think about it until his death. He read as much material on Buddhism and Hinduism as he could get his hands on. If we can go to the next image, please, Alex. This is a page from a journal that Wagner kept at one point during his life called The Brown Book. And in it we can see in his... not that one, the other one. Sorry. We just stay with that one for a moment. This particular image shows Wagner on the left, Shopenhauer on the right, and in the middle, a Buddha image that was actually owned by Shopenhauer. Then if we look at the page from the Brown Book, we can see in Wagner's own writing his thoughts, mainly connected with his ideas on Die Sieger, about Buddhism, in which he equates truth with nirvana and night, music with Brahman and twilight, and poetry with samsara and day. These are all Buddhist concepts, and he relates them to the ideas that were developing in connection with Die Sieger. So it wasn't simply something that he looked at in passing, it was something that he thought about in depth, and he found inspiration in these ideas for his style of composition. So in the 1850s, we can say that his focus moved very much from politics, which had consumed him as a young man, to metaphysics, and we can see this happening in The Ring from Die Walküre onwards. Although when working on Die Walküre in the early 1850s, he wasn't setting about consciously to make this transformation. It happened almost in spite of himself. And it was only after reading Schopenhauer that he could say, "Now I understand my own Wotan." He came to recognize that there was a world of difference between the conscious mind, who we think we are, and the reality of the unconscious mind, who we really are. And in Act 2 of Die Walküre, Wotan, in that extraordinary scene with Brünnhilde, his other self, as she calls herself, confronts his true nature and concludes that there can be only one way out of his predicament, das Ende, the end, self-annihilation. At the heart of Schopenhauer's thesis is the notion that willing, wanting, longing, and craving are not just things that we do, they're things that we are, and they're the source of our unhappiness and all the evil and strife in the world. We can only avoid this destructive element in our nature by achieving a state of detachment, an extinction of craving, desire, and illusion, and the attainment of absolute peace, akin to the Buddhist concept of nirvana. Furthermore, said Shopenhauer, in the arts, and music in particular, we can have a temporary window on the achievement of that state of detachment because the arts take us out of ourselves. The interesting thing about Schopenhauer's view of music was that it stood apart from the other arts because it was a reflection of the will itself, that driving force within us, whereas the other arts were merely a representation of that. This was a profound development for Wagner because you probably know that his initial idea was a synthesis of the arts. And in order to synthesize the arts into one greater art form, there is a presumption that they are, to some extent, on an equal footing. And the revelation that came with his reading of Schopenhauer, which probably he believed instinctively anyway, was that music had a particular role to play in expressing those fundamental elements that constitute our will, our subconscious personality. And I think the lesson really that comes out of his discovery of Schopenhauer's works is that he recognized himself that he had to distinguish between what he believed intellectually and what he felt instinctively. And his works were evolving as the fruit of his instinctive feelings, while at the same time he was trying to rationalize them and give them some sort of logical construct. And he realized after reading Schopenhauer and re-examining the works of his own maturity that he was instinctively moving in this direction. So in a sense, Schopenhauer was not a new thing, was not a discovery, it was an affirmation of what he believed and felt instinctively anyway. And the most significant expression of this belief of the special power to music, in music, to represent our deepest feelings and awarenesses is to be found in Tristan und Isolde, which was developed shortly after his reading of Schopenhauer, because in Tristan we find that it is essentially the music which drives the drama. But there are some very interesting things about the text of Tristan that I'd also like to mention, and that is the extent to which the words that Wagner prepared for that opera draw on another aspect of Eastern philosophy, and that is the Hindu Upanishads. These are mythical, poetic texts that were developed between the 8th and 4th centuries BC. And we find many references in the text of Parsifal to the words, the poetry of the Upanishads. Audiences couldn't cope with this at the beginning. They thought the text of Tristan was gibberish. But when you look at how many elements in it, in fact, reflect these early Hindu ideas, then I think it's clear to see where he's coming from. When Tristan and Isolde sing there I myself am the world, they're drawing on one of Schopenhauer's favorite passages in the Upanishads. I am all these creatures and beside me there is no other, illustrating how someone contemplating nature necessarily draws nature into himself, transcending individuality and joining with the sublime. When the lovers seek to merge their personalities, Tristan, you, I, Isolde, no longer Tristan, and so on, they're echoing another verse of the Upanishads. As the flowing rivers disappear in the sea, discarding their name and form, thus the illuminated one, freed from name and form, enters into the divine spirit who is greater than the great. When they sing heart to heart, mouth to mouth, bound together in one breath, the Upanishads are there again. The Sanskrit word Atman, breath or soul, is often used in conjunction with truth, infinity, and the supreme Hindu deity, something beyond comprehension. And Atman is related etymologically to the German word for breath, Atem, and we find the most vivid expression of this connection in Isolde's final vision, in which the once living Tristan is transmuted into the immensity of the world's breath. Indeed, a passage in the Upanishads which reads, "The Atman is beyond sound and form, without touch and taste and perfume," clearly inspired other lines of the Liebestod. How they swell and clamour round me, shall I breathe them, shall I hear them? Shall I taste them, dive beneath them, breathe my last in sweet perfume? Thus we see another aspect of Wagner's knowledge of Eastern wisdom and its direct relationship to the great works of his maturity.
Paul, a comment?
Yes, the first comment is just to emphasize how widely read Wagner was in all of the Eastern ideas. It wasn't just Buddhism. And there's one of my favorite small quotes from one of his letters to Ludwig in 1865. He's going off on vacation. And he says, "And now, in spite of the wind and weather, off to the mountains. My trunk is being packed, my faithful servant and the dear old dog are accompanying me. An old Indian epic, Ramayana, is coming too. Siegfried, in his manifold guises, shall breathe anew on mountain heights." Is that Wagner not only had a copy of the Ramayana, which is the great Hindu epic about the hero avatar Rama, but he sees Siegfried as Rama in a certain kind of panoramic context. And the reason I'm mentioning this is it's very important to understand how Wagner uses religion in his operas. He is not interested in any kind of sectarian dogma or doctrines. Is that what he's interested in is symbol. And he uses the aspects and symbols of various religions in his own music dramas. And I wanted to do a very brief quote from Barry Millington because he sums up what Wagner was saying in Wagner's own work, Religion and Art.